It's such a joy to be together, to be able to talk to each other. I almost hate to interrupt, but we are here also for this workshop. And I thought I would open with just a few opening comments, and in particular share with you some of the questions that haunt me, and ask you to grapple also with those questions. And then my intent is really that this will be primarily discussion, because I think that you've been talked at enough, and I'd like to spend time for us to work together in discussion. So I was so struck this morning by the opening hymn, the beauty of that piece of music. And one of the lines towards the end, and I don't have it written down, was, "Can we change how we live?" Do you remember that line in the hymn? It was towards the very end. And I had thought, when I heard that, I thought about what I was intending to do for this workshop. So I want to just call us back to that hymn for a moment. And then to say, if we are here, if this amazing creature, the human being, if we're here with a purpose, if God has created us with a purpose, and if that is, as God says when God makes Adam, to serve and preserve, or serve and protect the garden. And then when God says, when Jesus is asked what the greatest commandment is, and he hearkens back to his own scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, and says to love the Lord your God and love your neighbor. If those are our purposes, and if unwittingly and unintentionally and with not realizing it, we've set up ways of living that are actually endangering Earth's capacity to sustain life. In other words, if things went on as they are with greenhouse gas emissions, Earth wouldn't continue to sustain life that is habitable by human beings. One of the things that has haunted me about that is realizing in the Genesis story, when God is creating and saying it is good. Remember how many times? 7 times, I think it is good. The word good does not only mean good, it means good in a way that is life-furthering. The Hebrew word is tov, T-O-V or T-O-B, whichever form of Hebrew you're spelling it. And I was giving a talk once on Genesis, and a Hebrew Bible scholar from someplace in Germany, I can't remember, afterwards came up to me and said, that word doesn't really mean just good. It means, the Hebrew word means a good that is life-generating, life-furthering. Well, then that becomes obvious, because as the story goes on, the creation story, new kinds of life keep being created, and they're told to bring forth more life. And then we find out that the history of this planet has been life continuing to further itself in so many marvelous ways. So it's a life-generating good that God says. But lo and behold, we're not threatening Earth, the human species isn't, but we're threatening Earth's life-generating capacity, because that life generation is dependent upon a certain kind of climate. So it's haunting to me to think that we would be doing the opposite of God's generative initial act, to create an Earth that is tov, life-furthering, and we're uncreating by endangering life's furthering capacity, Earth's life-furthering capacity. So I think about that also. So if that's the case, and we didn't intend it, we didn't, our parents, our grandparents, and our generation, and the young generation in front of us that has adopted the same way of life, none of us intended to be damaging Earth or causing. When I went to India, I was in India. I was called there by the Council of Churches of Northern India, and I was called to come and work with them on eco-justice work. They were requiring an eco-justice curriculum in 40 seminaries connected in one particular part of India, and we were working together, and that's where I learned. The church leaders there told me about the 25 million climate refugees, and this was almost 10 years ago. So 25 million climate refugees then that I hadn't even known about, because we don't necessarily know what's happening as a result of the high consumption lifestyle that continues to create these greenhouse gases. So that's all to say that if we are called to change how we live, we're called now in the next, especially 5 to 7 years, to do that. So that is huge. The more we learn about human beings, the more we also learn some of the behavioral scientists and cognitive scientists are talking about how averse we are to change. I'm reading a book right now that's called Immunity to Change, and it's all about how we're wired to not want to change our ways. But we're called to, by the call to serve and preserve the earth and love our neighbors. So that presents an enormous challenge, and it presents a challenge for which the church is equipped, or could be, or should be equipped. Jesus called people to repent and change way of life. We are given the Spirit of the living God to live in us, to serve God's ways on earth. It seems to me that the modes and the forms of change that are needed are so many that it can become overwhelming, and we don't know where to go. We don't know necessarily what to do. And I like to think of that as a huge fog, and that it helps to put a flashlight into that fog to shed some light on how to bring forth change. And one part, I think of various tools, and one tool that has become useful to me is to think about change on 3 levels of how we live as social beings. And one of those is lifestyle. So by lifestyle, I mean, and this is kind of the easiest level. By lifestyle, I mean the ways what we eat, and how we clothe ourselves, and how we transport ourselves, and how we warm our houses and our buildings, our churches, the daily practices of individuals and households and institutions. Your synod has been very involved, many of you, in different ways in lifestyle change. This assembly in itself is an example of that. You have out there for coffee, we didn't have paper cups, did we? We had, and that was an intentional decision to not use plastic or paper cups. Our seminary is doing lifestyle changes. We're slowly moving to be plastic-free. So we don't use well, we haven't gotten there all the way yet. But one of the things we'll be doing is commissioning a little silverware packet for every student and faculty and staff and guests. So we don't need any plastic silverwares. Everyone will have a little pouch with their own silverware in it. Or we have mugs with everyone's name on it, so you don't. So these are just tiny examples. Or how many of you drive a partially electric or an electric car? So that's an example of lifestyle change. Or have decided to, instead of heat your houses to whatever temperature, to keep it a little bit lower. That's an example of lifestyle change. Or all kinds of things. The second level of changes is harder and harder to grasp, and that is social structures, structural change. So we impact neighbors more through the systems we're a part of than through our interpersonal relations. The political, the economic systems, the military systems, the cultural systems. Can someone give me just an example of how we impact people, other people, through the systems we're a part of? Everybody, yes, please. Zoning, yes, say a little bit more. Good. Okay, so zoning through all kinds of things that dictate lifestyle issues, and so that's a very good point. Social structures also help to shape lifestyle issues. Very good point. Another example of how we impact people through social structures. It's all over us. Yes.
Acceptance.
Pardon me?
Acceptance.
Say more. Yes.
Say more.
Yeah. Okay, so cultural systems of what we accept as normal or natural or inevitable. Yes, accepting what we can't change or falsely accepting what we can change. Very, very good. One of the things that I ask my students to do at the beginning of a class is to put into their mind a question. And I say, it's the only thing I'm going to dictate to you that I want you to write down. And it is, what in any circumstance is uncritically presupposed, accepted, as natural or normal or inevitable or God's will that might not be? So give me an example of something we accept as normal or natural, historically or contemporarily. Yes? And the word you said is death, is that right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's beneficial to the patient,
Mm-hmm.
if it's not beneficial.
Mm-hmm. And when you say if it's beneficial, what was the it?
Life.
Oh, life. Okay, carrying on with life, continuing. Okay, very, very good. Yeah, that's another really important issue to how long we should necessarily maintain life to the benefit of the person or not. So the point over here, I think, was that one form of systems of which we're a part is our cultural systems of what we consider to be the norm, what we consider to be the way things are, that ought to just go on, that might not be a norm. I mean, they are a norm, but they might not necessarily need to go on. Examples historically are many. All of us live within lifetimes in which it was normal for women not to have the same rights as men. So it was normal to not ordain women. For many, it was not questioned. But then we later began to learn that, wait a minute, women are as capable of being pastors as men are. So the extent to which, and so, for example, to bring it more to home here, we accept it as normal that we would hop in a car that burns a lot of gas and go wherever we need to go. That we assume to be normal. But if one looked at it, say, 25 years into the future, one would say, what on earth were they thinking? What on earth were they thinking to fill the land with streams of big metal automobiles, burning fossil, throwing greenhouse gases into the air? I mean, big ones. Remember, even a few years ago, cars were even bigger, and one driver going down the freeway, and you live in Kansas, maybe you don't have traffic as bad as we do, but you should see it. Rows and rows of, but we assume that is normal. Mind you, in some years, they're going to think, what on earth was the madness? So I'm only saying that because that these systems of what we think is normal, like how plastics became normal. I'll be right there with you. Plastics became normal as of about, maybe, I can't remember when the whole plastic revolution started, maybe 30 years ago. And it was the petroleum, it was the fossil fuel industry that really promoted plastics. So all of a sudden, plastics. Little did we know that there would now be a plastic island in the ocean the size of Texas, and that little plastic particles are disintegrated into our water in our food system, so that they find plastic microparticles in women's breast milk. Plastic is start to study plastic, and we see, oh my gosh, what were we doing? And now there are many, many young people doing the plastic revolution, trying to get rid of all of these use of single-use plastics. I remember once when I was a long time ago as a child, someone was talking about throwaway single-use somethings, and it sounded like something in the science fiction future. But now it's all kinds of single-use throwaways. Plastic isn't necessarily normal. I was watching a show the other night that took part in Denmark, and it took place in Denmark about, I don't know, it's early 20th century. And there was no saran wrap over the food that people carried from house to house. Carried from this house to that house, or there wasn't a stitch of plastic in the food. So my point is that what we consider normal that is destroying Earth's ecosystems might not necessarily need to be considered normal. So systemic change has to do with our perception, that has to do with cultural systems. It also has to do with political and economic systems. So we consider it, the question I had asked was how we impact people through systems. Is that the question you were going to respond to, the person with the black sweater on?
Yeah, I thought that was very powerful.
Absolutely. And we're talking about many things here at one time. So let me just say, one of the things we're talking about is I'm talking about change on 3 levels: lifestyle, and we're on the 2nd level, social systems. And social systems include our economy. And you're talking about our economy. Social systems include our food systems. Now, I'm going to step aside from that framework because I still want to move on to the 3rd level, but I want to step aside from that in order to go back to what you're saying. Because one of the challenges in shifting to a renewable energy economy instead of a fossil fuel economy, because it's the burning of fossil fuels that's one of the main things that shoots greenhouse gases into the air, as well as other things like mega raising of livestock. One of the challenges is to do that in ways that don't damage or leave behind the people whose livelihoods are going to change. So for instance, shifting, if we decided as a society to eat less meat, that would impact livelihoods. If we decide as a society to use less coal or oil, that impacts livelihoods. People are making their livings by coal and by oil. So the idea that is emerging globally, as well as here in the US, is of not just a transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a renewable economy, but a just transition, a transition with justice. That means not leaving behind people. That means the coal workers who are going to be displaced, the public policy and this is systems, public policy impacts political and economic systems. The public policies that we enact to bring a more ecologically sustainable society have to also serve the well-being of protect the people who could be left behind. So that concept of just transition, that's been really important in the Lutheran Church's advocacy. So systems, all kinds of systems, taxation is can be a matter of life and death. Who has food and who has water? Criminal justice systems, what we accept as minimum wage public policies. So public policy impacts systems. I'm going to move just on one thing. I want to bring up the third level, and that is worldview or consciousness, how we perceive. So we can make changes on lifestyle level, on social systems, especially through public policy work, advocacy, and consciousness, worldview. And that's part of where theology comes in. The crucial level of helping to shape our consciousness, our worldview. An example of that comes to mind instantly is our consciousness, our theology about salvation. So many of us were brought up to think that salvation was just for the human individual soul after death. And now we learn by studying the early church that that was one idea of salvation. But the early church had other distinctly different ideas of salvation. One of them was that the whole cosmos is saved, that God is saving the entirety of creation. Now, that has implications. If I think God is saving me and my kids and my friends and other Christians or even other people for life after death, that says that there's not that much importance going on with life on earth now. But if I think God is saving us partly to live the life that God intended now and is saving the entire cosmos, all of creation, that brings different responsibilities for how I'm supposed to live. So my point is really just to say that it can be helpful to think about engaging as congregations in change on all three of those levels. And a congregation in lifestyle change might decide to do no more styrofoam, might decide to put solar energy on its building, might decide to promote carpooling to church, all kinds of lifestyle changes. A congregation on social structural level might decide to have start advocacy campaigns. Where I came from in Seattle, in Washington State, we had a whole network of, throughout the state, I don't know how many, maybe 50 advocating congregations we would have tables out after church for things to sign for public policy issues that serve the well-being of earth and serve the well-being of poor people. A congregation on the lifestyle, on the consciousness level of worldview, worship shapes worldview. So the kind of worship we had this morning helps people to be shaping a different worldview of honoring creation. So if we were to think about change happening on all three of those levels, there's a beauty in that they impact each other. So in a little bit, in a moment, I'm going to ask you all some questions. First, I'm going to ask you for questions you have or comments, but then I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and let me tell them to you now. One is, if you really believed as a congregation you could make a difference, what would you do? If you believed you could make a difference about caring for creation, about countering climate change, what would you do? And when you answer that question to yourselves and with one another, I want you to think about actions on those 3 levels. The level of lifestyle in your congregation, the level of impacting systems, and the level of worldview or consciousness. What would you really do if you thought you could make a difference? And secondly, what gets in your way? What gets in your way? I spent a significant part of my doctoral dissertation on that question. What gets in our way? And third, how can you overcome that barrier? How can you overcome that barrier? So those are 3 questions. What would you do if you really thought you could make a difference? Secondly, what gets in your way? And third, how could you overcome that barrier? But before we go there have been a couple hands in the air, and I want to check with those, and yours is one of them.
Yeah, one of the questions, what gets in the way
Yeah.
is the Bible.
Ah.
The Bible says there are men, there are women.
Uh-huh.
And my reality is that some people are in between there and are having trouble figuring out, and they should be included in the church as much as any of us should be included in the church. So that's my, what's getting in the way.
Okay, that's the Bible. And I think that's a very,
It's an interpretation of someone else,
sure,
but it's not mine anymore.
yeah,
Where do I go with that? If I'm a Lutheran and I
Yeah.
wanna base my stuff on, I'm coming from a Missouri Synod background.
right.
Long ago.
Yeah. But, and are you asking me a question?
I think so.
Okay, and the
Doesn't God create people who are mysteries?
yeah, okay. So,
A mystery in creation, right?
okay, so there's a lot of questions in what you're saying. That's the point, and I wanted to know which one you wanted me to look at. I would say, and there are a lot of questions in there. I mean, one of them is, you said the Bible gets in our way, and I want to address that question as well as the more explicit question you just raised. The Bible gets in our way. Sure it does. Of course it does, because we live with histories of biblical interpretation. We live with incredible histories, and they are interpretations. So one of the things, let's see. When I was in India, no, I wasn't in India. I was in Geneva, working with a team of about 6 Lutherans from around the globe, working on issues of economic justice. And I said to one leader from India, and he had been involved in organizing up in the hinterlands. He had been involved in organizing against bauxite mines, because the bauxite mines, and the bauxite is used in our tin cans, etc. The bauxite mines were wiping people out of their villages and their areas where they had lived for centuries. And so they were resisting that and trying to get the bauxite mines to close. They were partly doing that internationally, getting governments like Sweden, the government of Sweden decided to divest from bauxite mines in support of this. But the point is, he had been up there, and it was dangerous organizing, because some of the people resisting the bauxite mines would be then targeted by paramilitary people. So it was dangerous. I said to this man, you know, in my country, what did I say? I said that in my country, there are people, some people with a lot of wealth that don't seem to really care about people who are really poor and don't see a connection. So someone might not see the connection that the minimum wage is too low and that they're making money off of it and someone else isn't getting enough to keep a house over their head, so they're living in the streets. There are people that don't see the connection or seem to care. He said, oh, that's the same in my country. I said, oh, and then I sort of thought, of course it is. But he said, I said, what is the answer to that? Because, I mean, what is the answer to that? He said, I'm getting to your question. He said, and this is the guy who's been organizing and doing dangerous work up there. He said, theological education and Bible study is what he said to me. So what I'm saying is, yes, how we read the Bible matters. It matters how we interpret it. And so one of the jobs in front of us as people of the church is deep Bible study. And we should all be reading. One of the fantasies I have is that Lutheran congregations would, in their adult Sunday forums, would be teaching Greek, so that we could all read the doggone text in Greek, because what we read is English translations of Greek. Now, how many of you have translated from one language to another? How exact can you get? I mean, even in the Romance languages that are similar, or the Germanic languages that are similar, you can't get exact. But from Greek to English is wild. So yes, Bible matters. And,
In the Philippines, two men could hold their hands and walk down the street, and no one would look askance at them.
so that...
Accepted cultural practice.
Okay, so that brings forth even more the challenge of reading the Bible in its context. So very, very important. The word that, one of the two words in the New Testament that has been pretty much weaponized against gay and lesbian people, I can't remember, it's malakoitai. Luther translated that word into the German, not as homosexual or pervert or whatever. He translated it as weakling. The word in Greek is closer to weakling, but we've translated it as having a sexual overtone and then used it against gay people. My point being only that, really deep study of Bible, because we do have biblical interpretations that get in the way of justice and peace. So that is an important piece of it. Yeah. So to do creation-centered or creation justice Bible study for a long period of time in a church would be a worthy move. To study creation-centered theology. Now we're rereading the Bible. Remember about 40 years ago, people started rereading the Bible from the perspective of women? And so we would find all these interesting new things about, now people are rereading the Bible from perspectives of the earth, and are finding that, lo and behold, the earth isn't just what we had assumed it was, like a big stage on which the great drama between human beings and God takes place. That's the way it was understood for many years in modernity. Like the earth is just a stage and it's the God-human drama. Now we're rereading it and finding out that no, earth is a player in this drama. Earth is an actor. God, in Deuteronomy, God calls upon the mountains to testify, to witness. In Genesis, God calls upon the earth, sea, animals and plants to bring forth life. God calls upon the fields to exalt, to praise God. So, yeah, very, very important piece of it. So Bible was one of the questions you were raising. About men and women, well, yes, we do have an Adam and Eve, but we don't, there's no place in the Bible that says there aren't other genders. It doesn't say there are no other genders. It just says, yeah. So that's a good point. That's the other point you were raising. But I'm not going to go more there now because that's not our topic right now. There were other hands up. I want to see if there's anyone who hasn't spoken with me in a question at all. maybe, good sir in the green shirt and then in the black. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's very real. These systems are complicated and they include people's livelihoods. Now, and you bring up food systems as a really important part of that. Food systems. Does anyone know the data on how many miles the average forkful of food going into a US citizen's mouth travels? I read 1,000. So imagine 1,000 miles. And imagine all the greenhouse gases that are emitted to get food into our mouths from 1,000 miles away. I remember this became clearest to me when I lived in Washington State. And I was beginning to be aware of the fact that the food of the future will be first local and regionally produced, and then turning to further away. And I remember realizing that in Washington State, you know what we produce in Washington? Apples. Lots of apples. I mean, mountains of apples. And I learned that we export apples to Chile and import apples from Chile. So an apple from Chile has emitted all those greenhouse gases to get it up to Washington State, plus the Washington State apples off to Chile. So that might be fine. It might be absolutely fine if we didn't have the problem of climate and of emitting all those gases, but we do. So y'all grow, I mean, I know North Dakota, I don't know Kansas, but do y'all grow a lot of wheat? Do you, it would be interesting to find out if you also like import wheat from Russia or something. That would be ridiculous. The wheat that you ate in Kansas should be produced around Kansas. But food systems are very, very complex. And so food systems change is part of the way to combat climate change. And one of the things that will mean is, as I said, more locally and regionally grown food. Well, how do we get to that without damaging people? We don't want to damage the food producers. So it's interesting. This means change on all three of those levels. Lifestyle change, people deciding to eat and support local farmers. I have some colleagues who, at Lent, instead of giving up chocolate, they give up food that's grown more than 100 miles away, except for their exception is coffee. So, and that's, you know, that's a good example, but there are many public policy ways to support local agriculture. How many of you have ever belonged to a CSA? Okay, there you are, a lifestyle change, deciding to eat more locally. How many of, I'm remembering the public policy work that was done in Seattle to create laws that required school systems to have a certain amount of their food from local farmers. So what did that do for local farmers? It meant they could survive because people were buying their CSAs and the school systems were importing. So what if public policy said the city's buildings had to use local food? And then that also gets at the worldview change. We have a worldview that says I can eat anything I want and I'm not going to think about the cost of it. But, you know, I was bringing delegations of people to Latin America for many years. I brought church people, Congress people, all kinds of people to do fact-finding and learn. And I remember one Mexican strawberry picker looking at us and saying, our children go hungry because this land should grow corn and beans for them and it grows strawberries for your tables. And my worldview is, it doesn't matter to me, you know, my worldview has been I have the right to those strawberries, but without thinking about the cost to someone else. of that system. So food systems change that will be just, not leaving people behind, is going to require change on the lifestyle level, public policy, and worldview. It's a very good example. Very good example. Yes, please.
So two-thing conversations where
Yeah.
we can be a both and.
Okay, very, very good. These are good questions. You all are making really good questions and comments. First, let me speak to what you said about social statements. It's amazing, the ELCA's social statements. And the reason I'm going to say it's amazing is because I agree with you. They're marvelous. And the Care of Creation one was written long ago. It's like maybe 20 years ago, 20, 25, and it's still very good. So we were ahead of our time in writing that statement. Yes, take a look at them. I also think they're evangelical documents. I think they proclaim the gospel. And I'm saying that you would not believe what I'm hearing from young seminarians. One of our seminarians converted to Lutheranism. Why? Because he read the social statements. He read the social statements and was so moved that he decided to become a Lutheran, and now he's studying to be a pastor. And they, what your bishop was saying this morning, the statements they say about the care and concern for, and the ways to get at and embody care and concern for people on the underside of power and privilege, and are amazing. So yeah, have a like a little orgy of reading social statements and learn a lot about the church in those. But your question is a very good one. When issues bump up against each other, and just to give a little background, when you said the straws, I think you're getting at the discussion about banning plastic straws and using paper instead. And ableist, because some people don't have the capacity to suck from a paper straw. It collapses. Is that what you're getting at? Okay. It's a very good example. So the intent of getting rid of plastic straws, again, you would be overwhelmed if you started to read about the damage of plastics. The food chain that begins way in the bottom of the ocean, and how many layers of the food chain are being damaged by plastics because of all of the plastics in various, including microparticles that the fish ingest. And the plastic dump sites in India and Belize and other places, our recycled plastics. But then you come up against your example of some people can't use a paper straw. And the example of, okay, again, if we stop using coal, what happens to coal miners is another example of that. One of the things that we teach at the seminary where I teach, we have some orienting principles. And one of them is that our students will be prepared for ministry, and the language we use is at the nexus, that is the intersection of race, class, gender, and earth. And what that means is be able to bring a racial justice lens to everything that goes on, and an economic justice lens, and a gender justice lens, and an earth justice lens. So that means trying to perceive things. What is the impact on people of color? What is the impact on impoverished, economically impoverished people? But another lens is what is the impact on differently abled people? So I think the first thing in the question of what about when these issues bump up against each other, my first response is for us to be ever, to refine our glasses so we can see more clearly those impacts. I, for instance, don't have a good lens for able-bodied privilege. Mine is not well developed. So it didn't occur to me that getting rid of plastic straws would be problematic for people who can't do that. It didn't. I used to think what a nonsense it is to have all these beeping sounds on the walk lights. you know, the walk lights, when they say to walk or not, there's beeping sounds, or there will be the numbers will go down from 12, how many seconds you have, 11, 10, 9, 8. I used to think, what a waste. What a waste of technology, of genius. What are we just doing that? And then I realized, wait a minute. If I didn't have vision, I would need those beeping sounds to tell me when it was safe to walk. Or if I couldn't walk quickly, I would need those seconds to tell me, you know, I can get across the street in 6 seconds. But if I couldn't walk quickly, I would need those 18 seconds or whatever. So my able-bodied lens is not well developed. For most of us, many of us in this room are white. Our racial justice lens is typically not well developed. So it really takes listening and learning to develop that lens. So it seems to me, listening to people of color to develop that lens, or my economic justice lens. I've learned to say, when it comes to voting for things, I've learned to say, what is the impact, what's the long-term and short-term impact on poor people of this? So my first step on that is to refine our lenses so that we can see. And the next really is to take seriously this idea of a just transition. And as you're studying and learning further, go and Google the word just transition, and you'll see all kinds of materials about how do we do this radical change in our society in ways that builds justice for people that could be hurt by it. I think we'll take one more hand, and then I want you to get at the questions I raised. Yes? I said, what happens to coal miners?
Oh, well, they lose their job,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Oh, your question is, should we have coal miners? Okay, so my response would be, that's one of the real testing points, or proving points rather, of the transition. How can we need to move away from coal. Coal is very, very dangerous to, it's such a high carbon producing. We need to move away from coal in ways that protect jobs for those miners. So that would mean any legislation that is going to slowly close down coal plants, it would mean it needs to include retraining and job placement and listening to the miners of what they're going to need to sustain a good livelihood when they can no longer mine for coal. That's the meaning of a just transition. So that's my response. There are certain things that we won't be able to continue having, but we can't make those people a sacrifice zone for the transition. One more question, comment. And and to do so not through charitable help. It's not, the coal miners don't need donations to live on. The coal miners need a dignified livelihood, work to do. So that's a very good example. That was something that happened with no justice, with no economic justice lens at all. And yeah. Okay, I want you all to, at your tables, I want you to first take about 4 minutes on your own, and I'll tell you when that is up, to think about these questions. Do you have all my 3 questions? If you really believed you could make a difference or live out your calling to serve and preserve the earth and love the neighbor, what would you do around creation care? Secondly, what gets in your way? And third, how will you overcome that barrier? And when I say you there, you can think about yourself individually, or you can think about your congregation. What would your congregation do? Let me say this. If you're thinking about yourself individually, not your congregation, then there's a 4th question. And that is, who's going to be your team? In other words, who are you going to work with? Because we need to disabuse ourselves of the notion of just doing it as an I. So if you're thinking just about yourself as an individual, the 4th question is, who's your team? Okay, take about 4 minutes just to play with those questions. And I need to go get my watch. Oh, no, excuse me. I'm sorry, I was not clear. Take 4 minutes on your own for your own self-reflection. And then I'll ask you to talk with people at your table. So your first 4 moments are just 4 minutes, are just you thinking. All right, I'm going to interrupt you for just a moment here to invite you to move from thinking on your own to talking at your tables. And we'll take 15 minutes to share what your thoughts are and to develop new thoughts on those questions. If you're at a table with just 2 or 3 people and you want to move to another shift so that you're sitting with a larger number, to combine 2 tiny tables, that's fine. But take about 15 minutes to come up with what would you do, what gets in your way, and how would you overcome that? Any questions before you dig in? Okay, go for it. Yep. Well, I tell you, I think you're smack on. Anyone else come to that kind of conclusion? Well, it makes you glad. It makes you very glad that the human being, the human being's capacity to deal with complexity, what we've got between our ears up here and the bigness of our heart make us capable of dealing with really complex realities, and this is one. So you've named a fact that's there. Yeah. And one of the great things we know as Christians, called to, it says here, traveling the way of Jesus on this thing, one of the things we know is that God, biblically, calls people to complex realities and equips them. So never are we called to go where we're not equipped, even though we don't feel like it, like Moses didn't think he was. Even when we don't feel like it, even when we know we fail a lot, look at the apostles, constant failing, and God gives us community. So we've got the promise that we are being formed for our calling, and we have companions on the way. Yeah, good. Other insights that arose in those discussions. That is so real. Nothing could be more important to get than that, because we are formed by modernity, which makes us think we're primarily individuals. Our agency to do something in the world is as individuals. That in reality is not what our story tells us. We are woven into a community in baptism, that is the church. When Jesus says, "This is my body given for you," the "you" is plural. Did you know it's not in the Greek, it's not an individual you, it's plural. So I love serving the communion, and I love looking at someone and saying, "This is the body of Christ given for you." In reality, we should be doing something a little bit different. I should be saying, "This is the body of Christ given for you and y'all." Because it's a plural you. We are simply not, Jesus didn't send anyone out one by one. So yes, that's real. This is work for us to do in the community, as community. Yeah. Please. Okay, you all are so wise, because the things that are coming up, just these 3 comments are smack brilliant. Accountability, because how many of you, none of you have done this, how many of you have said, "This I'm going to do, this," and then what happens 6 months later? 6 days later. Okay, it's so real. I mean, I have journals full of what I'm going to do that I read back and I find I didn't. So one of the realities is, and I think this is part of what I was going to talk about tomorrow, but I can't remember. I had so many pages I could have talked for days, and I had to eliminate things. But one of them is accountability. And one of the things we talk about is accountability circles. And literally deciding, asking someone to be an accountability buddy or an accountability circle of 3 or 4 to hold us accountable. So for instance, I, a couple months ago, was having coffee with a friend, and we were both needing to learn to say no to some things because of completely overwhelmed work lives. I mean, just completely overwhelmed. And boy, I'll tell you, when I told my husband this story, he was so happy. We decided to hold each other accountable for actually saying no to some things. So I forgot. She sent me an email about a week later saying, hello, accountability buddy. I just said no to thus and such. So yes, that's a serious and meaningful thing to do, to hold one another accountable. Not in a blame and shame way, but it's good to know that you're checking in. And so that's something a congregation could easily do. Yes, very, very good. I have become aware that I thought we had until 3:15, but the next workshop starts at 3:15. So I believe that means we're supposed to end so people can move their bodies a little bit before the next one. So we will do that, but first let me thank you for your conversations and for the wisdom of complexity, accountability, and community. Yeah, good, yes.